yeah, it's an artifact of what we would like to see become the past. And it really, represents everything around the climate crisis in terms of it is low-income neighborhoods of color that surround this refinery, which would never be allowed to be built in the present day, so close to where people live. Yes, especially wouldn't be allowed to be built, at all, anywhere near white people. There was a massive explosion at the refinery just a few weeks ago that could have killed 1 million people within 10 minutes. There's a particular chemical that could it have gotten in the mix of the explosion. It could have traveled 10 miles in no time, and people could have died on impact. And it allowed, the story to be brought to the fore that South Philadelphians like Miss Sylvia and Miss Jeanette have been telling for generations about the danger and the devastation and the harm that this facility could cause. And this explosion literally and metaphorically woke up the region to the stories that South Philadelphians have been telling for a really long time. And because of Philly Thrive's organizing and what we figured out around building very strong, grounded, loving, multiracial organization, I believe we were able to step up in the moment of the explosion, and the stories that needed to be told about the history of this facility were able to be told on front and center stage. And it wasn't just about, this explosion, what's happening right now. The history that we have to look at and that has to inform where we're going forward was able to come through. And I was counting last night, I think 12 to 15 Philly Thrive members, Black South Philadelphians, were telling their story with everyone listening, and that's exactly how it should be and how it needs to be. I guess my role, I think today, my intention on the panel before I hand it over to O, is that, I represent one of the white people in Philly Thrive who made a series of decisions and commitments and actions to figure out what it means to attempt to support the leadership of people most impacted, which are people targeted by racism and most heavily targeted by capitalism. And I think there's no prescription, there's no set of instructions of how white people need to think about that, but we absolutely have a role as the pawns of white supremacy. We are trained from the womb and before then to be the foot soldiers of white supremacy, and it is our central responsibility, I believe, in order to win climate justice, to recover our own humanity from what white supremacy and being trained to be the perpetuators of white supremacy. It's about reclaiming our humanity, and it's about, we're not going to win climate justice, we're not going to stop the climate crisis if white people do not make it a wholehearted commitment to figure out what it means to take on racism as the central project. So I'm going to try to offer some of the stories that I've learned and that white folks in Philly Thrive have been trying to figure out over the last several years.
So a part that I participate in is inviting people to hold their breath for 3 days. So that's why we're standing for the right to breathe. Because the bottom line is, we can live months without food, we can live weeks without water, you can live less than 4 minutes without air. And so it's imperative that we stand collectively for everyone's right to breathe, not just white men. Because that standing for the right to breathe is for our trees, is for the animals, is for the ocean. So in this moment, what I would like to do is invite you to breathe. Can we get everybody to take a really full, deep breath? And then let that go. Let's do 3 more of those breaths. And what I would like you to do is really feel your body breathe and how precious that is. Let's do 2 more full deep breaths. And let it go. Another breath. And let it go. The first thing you do, as soon as you come out of your mama's belly, out of her womb, the first thing you do is breathe. That is our birthright. And it is not to be sold for any price. I invite you to breathe.
Thank you. Thank you for that. On this land, of course, as we began, there's a long history of fighting for the right to live, for the right to breathe, for the right to continue to be here as First Peoples, as Indigenous peoples. And one of the people who's continuing and carrying forward that fight, especially through the power of story, of saying who we are, where we come from, where we're headed, articulating that kind of a narrative and vision, is my friend Jade here, and who has done that with Indigenous communities, as I said, from the Amazon all the way to the Arctic. I'm wondering how what Carol and O have spoken to here in Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, what they're fighting for and against with big oil meshes with your experience and your work.
Thank you, Julian. And thank you, Carol. Sorry, speaking up. Alexa.
Who knows who's over here?
Sorry.
We
So
just
many times.
met.
It's,
Yeah.
and that's actually my mistake. It's Alexa and O.
Yeah.
But for the record, they did change it up
We
on me
did,
like
we
2 or
did.
3 times.
Thank you for your stories. And I just want to introduce myself to you in my original, or my mother tongue, my original language. So, Yate, Shike, Doshe, Dine, She'e, Jade, Begay, and Nishet. I come from the Southwest. I'm Dine, or Navajo. We don't use Navajo. It's a settler term, so I prefer Dine. And I'm also Tesuque Pueblo. I live in Santa Fe, which is also known as Oge in my Tewa language. And I'm honored to be on this land, stolen land from the Lenape people. I'm gonna adjust this. So yeah, everything you were talking about really resonates with me from what I've seen in various communities from my nation, Navajo Nation, or the Neta rather, and from like the coal plants, and from what I was just 2 weeks ago in the COFAG territory in Ecuador, and they're dealing with so much contamination and pollution from Texaco oil fields, and so down there, and then right now up to the threats in Alaska. Alaska is going through a heat wave and is suffering a lot of air quality issues because of wildfires, and it's burning up there, and there's a heat wave in the Arctic, which is scary for so many reasons. So yeah, there's just so many connections, and more we're just seeing our communities, which are Black, Brown, Indigenous, face these impacts, and we knew this. This is no surprise to a lot of our communities. We've been saying this for decades, that we will be the first and worst hit by all of these climate impacts, and so, I mean, so many people have said, whether it's in the bayou, whether it's in the Amazon, or in the Arctic, that we're the miner's canary, and now we're finally getting that recognition, kind of, sort of, where we have someone in so-called leadership saying that climate change doesn't exist, it's a hoax. So, yeah, with storytelling, I mean, that's the narrative we're trying to shift, and bringing more of these stories to light in creative ways, because I think for our bubbles, our insular bubbles, whether it's our Indigenous communities or people of color, like we know this story. Even in our environmental and climate movements, we've been seeing so many of these stories circulated for, maybe a decade now. So I think now we're challenged with like, how do we tell these stories in really creative ways that not only shift a narrative, but get the people who are on the fence, who are on the opposition, to really begin to empathize with what we're going through. And luckily, we get to explore that here, and also throughout the day, we'll be talking more about communications and climate change specifically later, Thanu and I, but yeah. How do we make those stories? That's the big question.
So Thanu, you've organized for immigration justice in New York City. I've personally watched you drum up media for marches and days of action that included hundreds of thousands of participants around the world. How do we make those crowds and our movement more diverse, more representative of the people who are going to be most impacted by climate change, of our communities, and how do we make that movement more powerful? Big questions, I'm sorry.
I did not drink enough coffee for that question.
You can take it whichever direction.
Well, what's up, y'all? Really happy to be here with so many friends and new friends. Really appreciate hearing what's happening here in Philadelphia. My name is Tanushka Yakupitiyage, Thanu for short. Plus points if you lead to learning how to pronounce my last name. Yeah, and so as Julian mentioned, so I actually first and foremost identify as an immigrant rights activist and organizer. I'm fairly new to the climate justice movement, so I've worked at 350.org now for a little over 2 years, but prior to that, I worked for a decade in the immigrant rights movement and for an organization called New York Immigration Coalition and other organizations. To answer that question, I'll just give a little bit of background. And the reason why I decided to make a bit of a shift, beyond the fact that I'm an immigrant and I'm also impacted, is that I really think that we're in a really critical time to be connecting the dots between movement issues. When it comes to migration and climate, by 2050, and the stats vary, we're going to see about close to 1 billion climate refugees. People moving both internally, within territories, and externally, between countries, etc., like across the world. And we've already been seeing this in the U.S. Whether it's climate, migrants moving from New Orleans to Houston, and then Houston to somewhere else because of the hurricanes, majority Black people. Whether in South Asia, I'm specifically from Sri Lanka, whether it's people from India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka moving because of floods or drought, whether it's Syrians impacted by war, but a really complex set of circumstances that very much has to do with a climate crisis. And from the continent of Africa, when there's so much news in Europe about people crossing the Mediterranean, and often we don't hear about the reasons why people are crossing the Mediterranean, which is because they can no longer till the soils on their homelands because of the climate crisis. And so that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to engage in the climate movement, because of the need to be making those critical connections. And to be honest, I was really, really culture shocked coming into the climate movement. My communities are Black and brown and immigrant, and I have not organized with this many white people in so fucking long. Sorry. I got real comfortable real quick.
Honest.
My bad. I keep it 100 at all times.
Preach.
And I think I'm still really dealing with that culture shock, and so it's been really important for me to really build with other folks of color in the climate movement. Yeah, and sorry, what was the question?
I think you hit it up.
Oh, okay, yeah. So when I think about sort of how to build a multiracial climate movement, I think it's really complex, and I think it's going to take a really, really long time. And I'll just be honest, I work for an organization that's really working and struggling on that issue. It's 350.org is an organization that was started by 6 white college students with a professor, and has since become, a global organization and does some really great stuff, and also has a lot of stuff to reckon with. And so I'm really clear about what that means for me as a woman of color working in an organization like that. And so, separate from my personal agenda, I feel like there's a lot of work that white-led organizations need to do, because, when we talk about, making the climate movement more multiracial, or bringing out, diverse people, into the streets, I really want to be clear, there's a difference between diversity and equity. That you can, be like, oh, we're gonna get, all of these people from different communities, but at the end of the day, it's really about power. And so for me, some of the ways in which you really build a multiracial organization, where you really, bring out, people into the streets, it's like a bunch of things. It's leadership, really following the leadership of indigenous peoples, of women of color, of black women, of immigrant women, of brown folks. I think it's also about authentic storytelling. And as a communications professional, I really think about this all the time, how we choose to tell stories matter, how we also make sure that we're not doing extractive storytelling in a way that really tokenizes people. I think a lot about how much space folks take, in the climate movement. This thing that's really been driving me nuts, since I've, been doing this climate work, is that I hear a lot of folks being like, climate change is the worst existential threat that ever existed, and if we just deal with this, we could deal with everything. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but I live in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and people in my community are literally getting shot by the police on a daily basis. Do not tell me that I need to go into that community and tell them the only thing they need to care about is climate change, because that's not true. And so I really think about what does it mean to authentically bring in communities who are, facing police violence, who are facing deportation, who are at the border right now and being told that they can't come in. And I really think about sort of the interconnectedness of our movements and the really important work of culture shifting, and I do a lot of that through the arts in my artistic life. Those are a lot of the things that I've been thinking about. So I think that in terms of, we're in a moment again where we really need to be making these connections, because we really want these authentic, mass mobilizations of people. We really need to be connecting the dots in a different way, and also speaking about the climate crisis in a way that actually connects to people's real lived lives.
Thank you for that. So I think a lot of what Thanu just touched on, identity, community, and culture, questions of narrative, shared experience, the things that hold those pieces of who we are together are, I think, really central to this issue, this question. In the environmental movement, we inherit, I guess, whether we like it or not, organizations, institutions, structures that were built by white men who range from guarding the rights to eugenics. This is the truth. Thoreau, Muir, a number of different founders of, capital E environmentalism. Developed some very troubling views. The institutions they built inherited those views. Those views were reflected in the ways in which we made things like national parks at the exclusion of indigenous peoples, people of color, the working people who were living in those places. all, I think, as professionals, as people, reckon with. And I think, at least for me personally, like Thanu, I would say that I have had a very troubling sort of reckoning with sort of the identity as a climate activist, as someone who's part of the quote-unquote climate or environmental movement. Until probably less than 2 years ago, I would not have in any way identified myself that way. The way in which I came into this movement in this space was through the indigenous sovereignty movement. Police shootings. Maybe their first experience in this Trump era was, seeing what's happening at the border and in what's the fact that we're caging children, and that is what is calling them in and saying that they need to take action. How do we create an inviting space for young people, people of color, the future of any sort of progressive politic, in sort of the spaces that we inhabit, knowing that they inherit this legacy that is a very troubling legacy?
Well, ooh, yeah. This is great. So, I mean, I think if we have agreed that the problem is systemic, I think that means that it requires some systemic solutions as well. And I think in many ways, the way that we have gone after this issue in our organizations has been super minimalistic or really narrow. Like, it's been about, it's been on the realm of interpersonal. It's been limited to like one transgression or a relationship between an individual to another person. But I actually think that if we want to tackle the problem in our organizations or in the ecosystem writ large, we have to go after it in a much more holistic way. And so we think about it, so for one example, like in Sunrise, we've tried to think about it in a number of different ways. I'm not saying that we're successful at all of them, but we're striving. So at the level of cultural changes in the organization, a lot of times this is just like a actually intentionally thinking about the kind of culture that we want to create that would be welcoming to all kinds of people, like regardless of race, class, ability, gender, whatever it is. And I think that looks like fostering a culture of storytelling and vulnerability that allows us to see each other as humans and connect on a heart-to-heart level. I think it looks like regularly practicing inclusion and just like actually saying that you want to be an inclusive space that actually is welcoming to all different kinds of people. I think there are, just like broader things that we do as humans that allow us to connect at a spiritual level without even necessarily talking at one another, like singing, like just breathing and things like that we've tried to just create into and infuse into our culture. So that's one level. I think another level is structural. Just like, who is your staff? Who are your volunteers? What do they look like? Who goes through your training programs? Who goes through your, we have a really robust fellowship program, and the first year that we ran it, it was 75 people and 40% were people of color, and we wanted to improve upon that. And so we worked really hard to make the program more accessible to people of color and really deeply recruit folks who were excited about this but were maybe like unsure about the climate movement. And our fellowship class this year is 63% people of color, 40% working class, and like super majority queer people. And that is like an intentional effort to structurally change our organization around hiring practices, but not just hiring for the sake of hiring, but also thinking about what structures of support do people need once they're hired. So creating, like identity-based spaces where people can come and process, move through their feelings and figure out how to translate that into their work moving forward. And I think the question of who holds power in the organization is really, really important. And I think we have this sort of like mentality that like, okay, now all the white people just have to leave the organization, and that's not true. It's like, no, we need to understand that we all have to grow and learn, and we need to stand in solidarity with one another. And sometimes that means speaking up, sometimes that means shutting up, and I think it means a constant process of feedback and of supporting each other in our growth. So there's those things. people to process their own. I wouldn't have come to that conclusion around my connections to my Indian roots and my climate work if I hadn't been asked about it repeatedly over a series of years. And I think that's an important feature in our organization as well. I think the interpersonal is really important, and I like addressing that is incredibly important, and finding tools for people to process conflict, like learn how to do conflict resolution, not just shy away from fear or guilt. And the last one I'll say is actually strategic and political. For so long, people are like, we have to care about racial justice as the climate movement because we feel bad. And that is a truly powerless place to come from. And I think, so something that I'm really excited about in our training program is like one of the core pieces of curriculum in our training program goes through the entire history of the last 80 years of American politics and how wealthy people in this country, time and time and time again, have weaponized and flared racial resentments in order to take away from the public good, to disinvest in the public sector that ultimately hurts people of color and working people. That happened, that was like Reagan's bread and butter and why people like Nixon got into power. And it set the conditions for Trump today. And that is a training that helps us understand that like, if we actually need to see mass societal transformation, but everybody out in the world is scared of the government, that's never going to happen. And that is our like strategic and political reasoning for why, like beyond the fact that it's just the right thing to do and a good thing to do, and that we have a basic value system that all people are deserve to live happy, dignified, healthy lives. In addition to that, that is why we stand in solidarity with each other, because we literally cannot win without one another. So those are some of the things in our own organization. I also just want to dispel the myth that we all have to do the same thing at the same time. And I think in some ways, like, when I think of like multiracial solidarity across movements, I'm like, it is okay for the person who wakes up every day worried about police shootings or wakes up every day worried about the immigration crisis to work on that day in, day out, and day out, because that is what they wake up feeling passionate and scared about and hopeful about. And I think what we need to learn to do better is to operate as a broader movement ecosystem. So to see the shared alignment, to see the fact that we are rooted in the same values, to see that we have a common enemy, and to see that we all benefit when we have a government, an economy, and a society that actually works for all people. So we don't all have to like work on this litany of issues all together, but we need to see each other in that as we're taking our bite out of the apple to fight for the whole deal. So, yeah.
I was actually about to turn to you guys, because it sounds like Alexa and O, Philly Thrive is sort of reckoning with these same sort of questions, organizing across race lines, class lines, in a local context. So yeah, you guys want to take it?
So I think one of the questions was also, how do we get more young people engaged? And I know when I was a young person, I needed fun.
Yes.
This is really hard work. It's torturous work at some level. However, my belief is unless we figure out how to bring fun to this process, my judgment is you're not going to get a lot of young people. So when I speak, I think of the word functional, and the first three letters in the word functional.
Fun.
And so the motto for me is, if it's not fun, more than likely it's not functional. We are used to having a master-slave mentality. In a master-slave mentality in which we are taught scarcity and we're forced into competing against each other within an illusion of scarcity at some level, or we have propagated the scarcity. Actually, we've created the scarcity. Nature doesn't do scarcity. That in order to create the generosity that this planet offers us, it's imperative that we dance more. So my belief is if you want more youth, create some dances, and then with the dances, have educational processes, right? To provide mentorship around theater. All the things that the youth love, give that to them, and give that to them in respect to environmental justice. So that's one. And the other part too is, to me, the thread is sustainability. So oppression is not sustainable. So as we are oppressing those who are migrating, I think it's imperative that as we're doing the work for liberation, that we explore how are people being oppressed and say no to that. To really gather that information of what oppression really looks like, and says there's no fun in oppression. There's no fun there. And so it's not functional, and we need to transform it.
Yeah, I love that.
So I'm sensing a theme here, and that's the theme of healing. And in my work, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of futurism. And the big question for me is, how can we see our future clearly if we're constantly burnt out, constantly being hit from, all attacked actually by all the different angles, whether it's police violence or climate change or pollution. And so one of the things that I think, which you were talking about, Varshini, is both on the personal level, but also on the collective level, this idea of bringing healing into our movement spaces more and more, and even starting with rest, and starting with also processes around healing grief. A lot of our communities are grieving, or they're angry, and they don't even know they need to grieve, and they haven't even been allowed the space and time to grieve what they've lost, and not just yesterday because there was an explosion, but because of genocide that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So I think I would love to see our movements, whether it's in direct action, whether it's in our internal structures, begin to bring more healing processes into these spaces. Because, like I said, it's going to be hard for us to see a clear future without anger, without resentment, if we're not healing on the emotional level and the physical level. Because as we all know, there's a thing called blood memory. We carry our trauma, and we need to heal that if we want to move forward with a sense of clarity, with a sense of being able to work together, because we are trying to build this bigger we. We are trying to learn what that is even. So we're not stepping on each other's toes and saying, like, you're taking too much space with your police violence work, or you're taking too much space with your indigenous sovereignty work, and that's a thing. So healing those traumas, I think, is really important for this work of building more solidarity and more intersectional movements.
So just to sort of summarize some of the brilliant thoughts of our panelists here, I think it sounds to me like part of building a more just, a more racially diverse movement has to do with bringing in things like healing, right? Like if we're going to call in our indigenous relatives, I think we have to reckon with the fact that we are people who survived genocide. Of course, if we are going to organize in solidarity with Black communities, we have to reckon with the fact that Black communities are still fighting for freedom on a land in which they were enslaved, in which their slavery and their labor built this country, built many of the buildings, I'm sure, in this city. I think if we're going to call in our relatives who come from places that are not the United States, we have to fact that they have never been fully welcomed here, never been made part of our communities in a proper sense. They've never been called in and said that they're part of who we are as people. I think we also have to reckon with the fact that like young people love following Cardi B and Lil Nas X and Meg Thee Stallion on Twitter. I mean, I know I do as a person. And that we need to have fun, right? We also need to dance, to your point. And one person on this panel who I know moves dance floors as part of her professional organizing and artistic practice is Thanu. So I just love to hear you sort of reflect and talk about that work.
Yeah, so outside of doing climate work, doing immigrant rights work, I'm a DJ. My DJ name is Ushka. My full name is Tanushka, so it's like Thanu by day, Ushka by night. Yeah, I mean, so much of my practice is actually around joy, and I think that it's so much gets missed in like a lot of these very like policy heavy pieces. Except for Julian, who like quotes Cardi B when he like talks to press, which is awesome. Yeah, I mean for me, I think the reason why. So I basically over the last like 6-7 years have created like dance floor spaces with other Black and brown folks and migrant folks, mainly in New York, queer folks, and I sort of use those spaces, use DJing as a way to really like bring in people. Who often like meet on the dance floors that we create, who like start to organize because they've met on the dance floors that we create, and sort of like, kind of like, in a way we're trying to like deal with trauma by like centering joy, and I find it really effective, and I think for the longest time I tried to keep like these things really separate. Like I'm an organizer here, I'm a DJ and like a cultural organizer over here, and more I don't really care about those like divisions. I think that where it shows up often is just in like the professional environments where someone wants to like act like a certain kind of cultural work is like fickle, and then like use it to like sort of be like, oh well, you're not like a serious policy person or a serious like communications individual. So I feel like that's something that I struggle with. But yeah, I would say that I mean, if we could build the kind of like climate movement where like, there's like multiple stages and there's musicians and there's like Cardi B and Beyonce are performing and there's DJs and like I would have so much more fun, to be honest. And I think that it's like a critical part of like how we can make effective organizing, because a lot of the time people really forget the cultural aspect of organizing, and the thing that moves people is not policy. The thing that moves people is culture and culture shifting, and that's what I try to do in my artistic work.
Yeah, it's not exactly about DJing, though I wish I She's awesome, by the way. You should definitely check out her work on Instagram and SoundCloud. But I think what's coming up for me is this like rising anxiety. Like everything that people have been talking about is actually immensely practical. And I think I feel this rising anxiety when we're like talking about all of the immensity of the problem. We're like, oh my god, 1 billion refugees. Like, oh my god, structural racism. This is also scary and big. But they're like all of the things. I love what you said about healing, and it's like it reminds me of like when we started Sunrise, or when we went on this strategic planning process for Sunrise. I don't tell many people this publicly, but for 2 days, we literally emotionally processed the last 5 years of our work in the climate movement, because we were holding so much resentment, so much fear, so much anger that was powerful because it led us to try to create Sunrise, but also was like holding us back in so many ways from actually envisioning a better, a movement that would serve us better. And that was really essential. And I think like from the fun angle, it's like, it just looks like incorporating games, or like incorporating, we have this thing called the No Talent Talent Show, which I think lots of people use. And it's really fun because it's like our distributed directors talent is like standing on her head for a minute while someone recites Shakespeare next to her, and it's just hilarious and allows us to be goofy and just like people can do whatever they want, right? Like think about it, self-expression and like being together in a way that isn't about being like we must solve the climate crisis at 11 a.m. at this retreat. And I think like I would if you take anything from this, if this is something you're thinking about incorporating in your own organization, is to like make it super tangible and make it super practical, because I think like it can sound very big and complicated, but in actuality, like the more people can be solving it in small ways every day, the closer we're going to come as a movement to solving the problem on a macro scale.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is so awesome, and I think a really key part of what we figured out in Philly Thrive about building real multiracial cross-class relationships is being full selves. I think white people especially, the way that we've been hurt by racism in our training is that we've, white people got some weird stuff going on. It's hard for us sometimes to have fun and to dance and to be our full selves, and I think we've just learned in Thrive that it's just not going to work if we're trying to just wear our organizer hat and try to recruit someone to this organization and build trust across race and across class. That's just not going to happen if we're being our organizer, robots. It's taken in Thrive to build a base of leadership and impact communities across difference, hanging out a lot, and like birthday parties to funerals to everything, and I think I've struggled with different organizer training I've gotten. I know I took a course from Marshall Gans that talked about kind of public and private relationships and keeping organizing relationships as a public relationship, and I just think, yeah, we get to have each other in this work, and it's the only way, that we're going to be able to build the trust. And the last thing I'll say is that when we are being our full selves together and truly sharing, everything about ourselves, that also leads to the redistribution of resources, which is the structural racism that's set up. So if O and I are in deep relationship and we're struggling with different, pieces of the targets of oppression, we get to actually share rides or share listening or share, that's where the transfer of relationships that I saw in, white folks in the climate movement was a shoring up of resources that weren't actually being distributed across the movement, and part of that was because there weren't real deep relationships where that could be redistributed. So I think it also, yeah.
I think we got to get some more funders on dance floors. I think that's will give you that. So I just came back from Aotearoa, the country more commonly known as New Zealand for people who are not from there. And I ended up on a dance floor with a bunch of indigenous folks from around the world. And one of the things that happened down there was that we were all engaging in and joining in, honestly, a lot of music that came out of Black culture. And one of the more awesome things was that there was this te reo. Te reo means the language in Maori, so it was a Maori song in which the rapper had written the whole song in te reo, and all of these Maori kids, people who also survived genocide, people who are also fighting for their future, for their rights, for their land still, were rapping along in te reo, a language that was literally beaten out of their grandparents, a language that is just now coming back. And they were doing it to rhythms that came out of the fight for Black freedom and liberation, in my opinion. I think that's the best way to put it. And I think that there's power in that, but it's not seen as powerful by the people who get to make a lot of the decisions that resource organizations, that build institutions, that write the policy papers, that pay the lawyers, conversation, it's often framed around lack, right? The fact that, man, we're falling behind on emissions. We are not where we need to be in terms of renewable share on the grid. The politicians still don't even know the science. Like, we often talk about this in terms of like things that we don't have, right? And the reason why, of course, we don't have those things is because they've been hoarded by other people. In some cases, they were stolen by other people, like this entire continent. But I think one important thing that I want us to take away from all of this is that we actually have a lot of the things that we already need, right? I think that there is way more power than is recognized in the fact that in Aotearoa, in New Zealand, there was a group of Maori college students and kids, basically, like my age and younger, who were coming together, forming community, talking about the issues that we face as a people in the 21st century, and doing it while moving to the rhythms of Black culture. And I think that that's really beautiful and really powerful, and I wish more people saw it. I wish more people who had the resources to help us fight saw it that way. I know that we only have like 5 more minutes, so I'm gonna give it to Thanu, and then I also, because like we're up on these risers, I want to open up a little bit to the audience if we have time for questions. So I'll give it to Thanu, and then we'll maybe take a question or two.
Yeah, just really quick on that point. I think that I really want to shout out some of the folks that 350 works with globally, in particular folks from the Pacific Islands, Fiji, and other islands, the Pacific Climate Warriors. There's some incredible artists in that movement, like Kathy Kitchener, who is a poet. And you know, I think one thing around culture shifting and how it pertains to building a multiracial climate movement is that, like, you know, I think that when we think about what it means to build things, it's not just like, oh, like, we need this poet to perform, or like, we need this artist to make this mural, or we need this DJ to DJ the thing. It's like, those people are also like a part of like what it means to like collectively create like the world that we want, right? Like, it's like when we think about policy, like, how do you really connect it to the world that we want? And from a communications perspective, I would just say that, like, you know, what you were saying, Julian, around like, like, you know, the numbers, like, you know, we have to be below 1.5C, like carbon emissions, et cetera. Like, I think that, I mean, obviously it's really important to really know that, but at the same time, it's really important to move away from fear-based messaging. We're not going to win by being like, if you don't do X, the planet is going to be destroyed, you know? Like, I think we really have to come from like, what do we want, and like, what is the world we want to build, because joy is such a huge part of it.
So I think we have like 4 minutes according to my watch. No? How many minutes? I'm over.
Whose time are you on?
All right. Well,
Whose time?
look, I don't write the schedules. Clearly, I would not have put this at 9 a.m. But I just want to say thank you, firstly, to our panelists for doing the work that needs to be done. Thank you all for coming. I would not have made it to a panel at 9 in the morning, so I'm very, very enthusiastic about the fact that some of you made it here. If you guys want to follow up on any of this stuff that we've talked about, I'm very findable on the internet. My Twitter is @Jade Noisecat. If anyone else wants to mention like ways in which you can get in touch or get organized, maybe real quick we can do that.
You can find us at phillythrive@gmail.com or anything on Philly Thrive. We'll also probably just be here if you want to talk to us after this.
And if at all possible, before we end, I'd like to end with, I got a story to tell. So
you can find out more about Sunrise at sunrisemovement.org, and I'm also on Twitter at Prakash, just without the E.
You can find out more about 350 at 350.org, and I am on all social media at @TY_USHKA.
And you can find out more about MDN Collective at mdncollective.org. And I'm on Twitter, Jade Begay with an _ before the J.
Awesome. You want to lead us?